Hola, ahí está, ahí está. Bueno, día complicado del mercado, ¿no? Semanas complicadas. Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos. Iremos completando a medida que vaya llegando la gente, pero no queremos empezar demasiado tarde para que no sea de noche. Arranco muy brevemente en español para darles a todos la bienvenida y agradecerles que están acá. Viernes, 5:30 de la tarde, después de una semana y de unos días como estos. Estamos todos muy cansados, pero creo que es una oportunidad única esta. Y como saben, hoy tenemos un invitado especial, una jornada especial, porque, y bueno, as I was saying, it's not every day that we receive someone as special as Professor Dr. Aswath Damodaran. It's an honor to have so many people here to want to listen to him. CFA Society Argentina constantly seeks to create spaces that can be disruptive in the local market, whether through the topics proposed or the speakers we bring. Today, I believe we exceeded even our own expectation with what has been put together. And before we begin with what we all came to see, I'd like to offer some special thanks. First of all, a special thanks to Professor Dr. Aswath Damodaran, who has boarded a plane from the other side of the world to come and deliver a marathon of lectures here and in Santiago de Chile, bringing us a little closer to the world's leading financial academia. Dr. Damodaran, it's an honor to have you here, and I hope you have a wonderful stay and an incredible conference here in Buenos Aires. It's also important to mention that the institutional support of our partners is essential to carrying out these initiatives, both financially and logistically. Today, we are joined by Schroeder's, Paraquit Fondos, Banco Comafi, Mega QM Fondos, Max Capital, Alaria Fondos, and Universidad Austral de Rosario. Thank you all for being supportive and for contributing to our mission. Also, I want you to know that none of this would be possible without the volunteers who donate their time to collaborate every day. Thank you to the committee that put together this conference. They are Mariano Fiorito, Cristian Brau, Matteo Rescini, Agustina Isidro, and Martín Merlo. All, of course, CFA charter holders. But it fills you with satisfaction. I highly recommend it. Thanks also to Lucia Cabrera, our staff, who follows us closely and disciplines us so that everything goes according to the plan. Finally, thanks to all of you who are here waiting me to finish speaking so you can listen to our incredible guest. Ultimately, this is all for you. So your presence here is as protagonists and not just assistants. I'd like to remind you that CFA Society Argentina and its volunteers are working toward a more ethical, sophisticated, and professional industry. We are going through an extremely important transition in the local and now international markets. And if we can contribute to that mission, we are already grateful. Well, without anything else to add, I introduce you to the person we all came to hear, Dr. Aswath Damodaran. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Is my mic on? Yeah, it's on. How many of you are CFA? I mean, no, you're supposed to be all CFA members. How many of you are not CFA members? Okay. How many of you are in the process of becoming CFA members? Right, CFA 1, 2, we're still working towards a 3-part? No. I don't have a CFA. I never wanted a CFA. Okay. But for the first 25 years, I think the first time I did a CFA keynote was in 1992. The CFA used to have an annual meeting every year when they were smaller, and now they've splintered. They have like 50 different ones. An annual meeting, it used to be all over the country, and I used to give the keynote for the first 25 years. And It's interesting seeing how big it's grown over the last 3 decades. It's kind of changed and morphed and become a much more international certification. But before I start today, there are 2 things I want to say. First is I'm not an academic research. I've never used doctor in front of my name. I find it's a very European thing to do, is to attach a doctor once you get a PhD. I don't like it. I don't do it. So it's fine that you call me Professor Doctor. I said, no, don't worry about it, right? Because I'm afraid that I'm going to be in a restaurant and somebody's going to be having a heart attack and you're going to say, is there a doctor around? And accidentally I might get up and I could kill you. So I am not a professor. I'm not an academic. I'm not a researcher. I'm a teacher. That's my first and foremost passion. I come from a family of teachers. My wife is a 5th grade teacher. My daughter is a 2nd grade teacher. My daughter-in-law is a high school science teacher. And I have the easiest of the 4 jobs. Okay? I teach the fewest hours. My kids don't have to have have to go to the bathroom. So basically, or if they do, I don't have to go with them. So there are advantages to teaching at the age that I do. And I happen to teach corporate finance and valuation, and people often ask me why I teach valuation. I teach valuation because you have to stay grounded. Valuation is never boring. It's always changing. Just when you think you've got things nailed down, markets deliver surprises. I left on Wednesday night. I was on the plane and I was checking my phone as I was leaving. Liberation Day was being let loose, right? So I went off in the air. 10.5 hours later, I landed in Santiago and the world had gone crazy. 48 hours, $5 trillion, right? Things change at the drop of a hat. I'll be back in class on Monday, and I know the first question I'm going to be asked. Every person in my class has to pick a company to value. I teach a class of 350 undergraduates and about 200 MBAs. So they're going to be there and they're valuing companies, and I know exactly what the question is going to be on Monday morning, and you could probably guess. What do we do now? We did a valuation last Tuesday. Do we have to redo the valuation today? What's the answer to that? Of course. The world changes, your value changes as well. So my topic for today actually reflects something I believe about valuation. Valuation is not a science. It's not. You can't do whatever you want. The essence of a science is you get the inputs right, you get the output right. 0 chance of that happening in valuation. So much as the CFA or accounting might think by having more stuff we can make it more scientific, I think that's actually a bad idea. This is not meant to be a science. And the sooner we accept that reality, the healthier the discussion becomes. It's not, because you can do whatever you want. The word I used to describe valuation is it's a craft. And the essence of a craft is? Let me give you the closest thing to valuation I can think of. Cooking. How do you master cooking? By reading cookbooks? I don't think so. What about watching TV? The Food Network. You can watch, great chefs prepare. You learn cooking by doing what? Cooking. And the first time you cook, what happens? Fire alarms go off, right? And you're going to order out online that day because, you're going to burn up something. But you learn. I still remember the first time I scrambled eggs. Nobody told me I was supposed to spray the damn pan. So 5 minutes later, the eggs are done. They look really good. They don't come off the pan. Pan and eggs went into the trash, but I learned a very important lesson about scrambling eggs. Spray the pan first. You learn valuation by doing. You don't learn valuation by reading or watching or listening. You learn valuation by doing. Which is a strange thing to say because I've got you for the next 2 hours, and what are you going to be doing? Watching me talk about valuation. It's kind of a waste of time in many ways, because your real work will start after we're done in taking perhaps what we've talked about today and trying it out. Take it for a ride, right? And I'll give you some exercises to do. because that's how you get better at valuation. So I'll start with the story of my very first valuation. It's in 1981. How many of you were born in 1981? 1, 2, 3, 4, a few, okay. But 6 of you. Most of you weren't even conceived at that point. And I'll tell you what I had to do to value a company. I had to write to the company for an annual report. Let me repeat that again. With a fountain pen, I said, "Dear Investment Relations Officer, could you please mail me your annual report because I want to value your company?" Mind-boggling, right? He said, "Why don't you go online?" That's what my kids say. What online? 1981. And I sent it by snail mail. 2 weeks later, to give the company credit, they did mail me back an annual report. They sat down with the annual report, and here's what I had in front of me to value a company. I had a ledger sheet. You know what a ledger sheet is? It's just a blank sheet of paper with lines in it. I had a pencil to my right. I learned very early in my valuation life, never use a pen. Because then if you change your mind, you've got to be scratching things out. No. And on my left, I had a calculator. I can still value companies with a ledger sheet, a pencil, and a calculator. But when you value a company with a ledger sheet, a pencil, and a calculator, how many line items will there be in your valuation? Remember, when you add a line item, every single cell has to be hand calculated, right? Almost by definition, your valuations are going to be parsimonious. You got to think about what the story for a company is to put it into those 11 line items to value the company. Last week, I value MercadoLibre for this class, for this session. So I want an S&P capital like when historical data becomes really difficult to use, and I sympathize with you in terms of looking at financial data when you're doing everything in pesos because nothing makes sense, right? There's like an implosion going on inside the numbers. Right? It took me a minute and a half to download every single data item from Capital IQ on MercadoLibre. And I said, I'm already here. Let me download the data for every Latin American retail company that is publicly traded. In 5 minutes, I downloaded the data for every single pub. In 6.5 minutes, I'd collected enough data that it would have taken me months to do, if at all, in 1981. I no longer use a ledger sheet, a pencil, and a calculator, though as I said I could. I have an Excel spreadsheet where much of the work has already been pre-done. In what sense? There are things you do in valuation over and over again. It's silly to keep repeating them. So if I have to capitalize an expense, it's already in there. If I have to estimate a cost of capital, the process is not reinvented for every company. It's called a Ginzu spreadsheet. It's on my web page somewhere. People download it all the time. And I entered the numbers into a much more powerful tool than I had in 1981. And I'm behind the time. There are people who use Python and AI, and their spreadsheets are even more powerful. But here's the bottom line. We have more data now than we did 40 plus years ago. Undeniable. Easier to access, a lot more data. We have more powerful tools today than we did 40 years ago. And I'm going to state this as an observer, and don't take it personally as, this is not about the CFA, it's not about any institution, but I think the quality of valuation today is worse than it was 40 years ago. Which is weird, right? How come if you have more data and more power, because the tools are running us, we're no longer running the tools. Most valuation classes around the world have become financial modeling classes. You become an Excel ninja. You know which combination of keys will turn every other row a different color. You can add worksheets with macros. And after a while, the macro is running you rather than you running the macro. We create 500 line items, 15 worksheets connected together. And after a while, we have no idea what's happening. The black box is driving out values. We've lost control of the process because we've essentially turned it over to spreadsheets. I understand, spreadsheets are great tools to have. But if you don't treat it as a tool, it becomes your mechanism for valuing companies. You've lost the script. So about 10 years ago, I started thinking about what it is that we don't do now that we used to do. And the answer is very simple. To value a company in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or even to the 90s, you had to start with a story because you don't have the luxury of having 1,500 worksheets connected to each other. We've lost the capacity to tell stories about businesses. So I'm going to start with a question that is going to be personal, but don't take it personally. You've heard the legend of the left brain and the right brain? The left brain supposedly controls your logical side, the linear thinking, the number side. The right brain is your creative side. Scientists say this is not really true, but I like the legend anyway. There's a left brain where you get numbers, the right brain. And each of us has a stronger half. So you ready for the question? I want you to look inward and ask yourself, if you were to classify yourself, which would you classify yourself as stronger? Are you more of a number cruncher or a storyteller? Look inward. There's no right answer. You don't have to look at your neighbor. What comes more easily to you, working with numbers or telling stories? Had a chance to think about it? I'll go first. My number crunching comes more naturally to me. You know, when did I know? I knew when I was 12 years old. It was after my first English literature class, and I was asked to read Moby Dick. And I did. I was a good kid. I came ready for a discussion of whales and captains. And about 15 minutes into the discussion, I noticed that nobody was talking about the whale. So I put up my hand and said, when are we going to talk about the whale? And I remember what the instructor said. She said, there is no whale. I said, what? Did I read the wrong book? I distinctly remember a big fish all the way through the book. She said, it's a metaphor. And my jaw dropped. And the rest of the class was about hidden meanings and things I didn't even know had a meaning in the first place. I remember coming out of that class with a singular conclusion. I said, never again am I going to subject myself to that kind of bullshit. And the rest of my high school life was laid out for me. I avoided the literature classes like the plague. It was Algebra 1, Algebra 2, Algebra 3, up to number crunching heaven. Get a number crunching degree, and if I hadn't been saved, a number crunching job. My guess is most of you have number crunching jobs. Or why did you write the CFA in the first place? Right? But even if you have a number crunching job, it doesn't mean you are destined to be a number cruncher. Maybe your parents said you can't be a literature major, you can't have a living, you got to become a business major or an accounting major. So I still want to ask the question, how many of you are more naturally number crunchers? Okay. How many of you are more naturally storytellers? Okay. Now, I'm going to take the number crunching group first and talk about the delusions that number crunchers share. As a number cruncher, I fall into these delusions all the time. The first is the delusion of precision. When in doubt, you know what number crunchers do? Add decimals. Which just makes us feel more comfortable. I don't know what the value is, let me add 4 more decimals. Right? The second is the delusion of having no bias. I work with the numbers. What do you mean I'm biased? It comes right out of this. See, I can show you the number. It's right out of that Kroll Cost to Capital book. You know how much damage that book has done to the practice of valuation around the world? With its stupid size deciles and the premiums with each decile. And finally, we operate in the delusion that if we put a number on something, we control it. There were all those banks in 2008 that thought they were okay because the value at risk looked okay. And if you hang out with only other number crunchers, guess what? They don't seem like delusions anymore. you feed into each other's delusions. I'm not a storyteller, but I'm going to list some delusions I see from the outside with storytellers, and you tell me if, as a storyteller, whether I'm missing something. The first is, storytellers are convinced that number crunchers don't dream in Technicolor. We dream in black and white. We're incapable of having any imagination. We're just boring people. Second, storytellers think that if they tell a really big story, they deserve a really high value. Look, I told you a really big story. Could be a fairy tale, it doesn't matter. And storytellers love the power of anecdotes. They're like my mother-in-law. And I don't mean that as a compliment. My mother-in-law makes up the most incredible things. And I say, how did you come up with that? I make the mistake of asking the question because she always tells me. I remember, about 20 years ago, she said, the best car to drive in a snowstorm is a Volkswagen Bug. The old Volkswagen Bug, the one 250 pounds, you could lift it up with one hand. I said, how do you come up with crap like this? I didn't use the word crap. And she told me, she said, 20 years prior, she had been in Lake Tahoe in the middle of a snowstorm, and I could see the story coming, too late to stop it, at a grocery store, and she drove back home in the snowstorm and made it home safely, and 2 other cars did not make it, and they were not bugs. And he says, so? She says, that shows you, right? Sample size of 1, amazing how you can extrapolate from that. And if you hang out with other storytellers, they'll tell each other anecdotes around the table. By the time they're done, they've solved every problem in the universe, anecdotally. We live in a world of tribes. Number crunchers gather together, storytellers gather together, we talk to each other. We don't even realize these are delusions. I mean, I'm lucky enough, I talk to very different groups of people. So on day 1, I might be in New York talking to a bunch of bankers, a lot of storytellers. To them, EV to EBITDA is like the alphabet you learned in kindergarten. It's become part of their language. The next week, I might be in Silicon Valley talking to VCs. VCs hate EV to EBITDA. You want to get a VC pissed off, just mention the word EV to EBITDA. So, your banker, go away. They probably have garlic in their pocket. There's a guy, like a vampire, get back from me, it might contempt. They tell big stories. And each group makes the mistake of thinking that they own the high ground. So 10 years ago, I said, look, this is not working. We need to find a way to bring the two together. And I'm going to describe what I think about valuation. I think about valuation as a bridge between stories and numbers. Sounds like an abstraction. But when I show you the valuation of a company, and you look at my revenues in year 10, you take an example. One of the companies I've valued repeatedly over the last decade is Tesla. Said my most recent valuation of Tesla. I've expected revenues of about $500 billion in year 10. $500 billion, right? So when you look at those revenues, you say, why are your revenues $500 billion? Here's the answer that doesn't help you at all. It's because I use a 50% growth rate for the next 5 years, 37% in year 6. What does that tell you? What do you even take issue with? You know what the answer I need to tell you is, what will Tesla be doing in year 10 that allows them to deliver $500 billion? Because that's a mind-boggling number. Why is it a mind-boggling number? What are the largest 2 automobile companies in the world in terms of revenues right now? Volkswagen and Toyota, about $300 billion. And what am I giving Tesla? $500 billion. So clearly in my story, they're going to become not just a successful automotive company, but they're going to become an incredibly successful, and even then they can't get to $500 billion. So in my story, there's got to be something else that gives them additional revenues. So in the case of Tesla, what is that something else? It could be automated driving, it could be robotics, it could even be their software. Any of you own a Tesla, without the software, it's just a hunk of steel sitting in your garage. Maybe one of these days, I have to tell you my story, for this is what I think Tesla will be doing as a company. Be an automotive company with a side business in automated driving and a robotics business that's small but profitable, and that's how I get to 500 billion. When you see my margin for Tesla, it's 12%, which is high for an automotive company, especially a mass market automotive company. Again, you should push back. Why? It has to be that those other businesses deliver 30 or 40% margins, because the automotive business alone can't deliver that kind of margin at that scale. Every number in my valuation, when you ask me why is that number what it is, my response has to be, this is my story for the number. And every story you tell me about a company, I'm going to ask you, where's it in the numbers? Story is pointless. I'll give you an example. About 2 years ago, a company called Birkenstock went public. Anybody in this room own Birkenstocks? Okay. Why do you like Birkenstocks? Why do you like them? They're comfortable, right? Do you know how old Birkenstock is? And it stayed like that, except for this stroke of luck. This German-American woman had gone back to Germany for the summer to spend time with her family, and she had foot problems. And she tried Birkenstock, and she really liked them. So she went to the owner and she said, can I take your very comfortable sandals back to Los Angeles to a shoe store, because I think it'll sell there. He was very resistant. He was very German. He said, no, we don't do stuff like that. And she must have been very convincing, because he did finally agree to let her take a couple of hundred pairs. I'd love to see how the airline agent led her on with a couple of hundred pairs, but things must have been a lot looser then. She goes to LA and a store picks it up. And the rest, as they say, is cultural history. Because you know who caught on to them? Hippies in the 1970s. It became the classic anti-establishment footwear, and you can see why, right? What did the hippies want to do? Whatever the rest of the world was doing, they wanted to do. You wore ties, they didn't wear ties. You wear underwear, they didn't wear underwear. I'm making that up. But basically what you were doing, they would not do. And what did the rest of the world do? They were wearing these uncomfortable shoes, and the hippies said, we'll show you. We'll wear Birkenstock. It became almost so it went from being a comfortable sandal to being this countercultural, this is a symbol, and it took off. And then it kind of settled in because the hippies went away and the demand for Birkenstock dropped off. And then in 1992, a young model named Kate Moss, went on to become one of the legendary models of all time, was on the cover of Vogue magazine at the age of 16, wearing Birkenstock sandals. And it took off on college campuses. We talk about brand name as something you create with advertising, but brand name is often created by being in the right place at the right time and strokes of these things you don't control. And Birkenstock has become a brand name. A brand name that celebrities wear without being paid to wear them. That's impressive. I've seen people on the Oscar stage wearing Birkenstock. It's the best kind of advertising there is. So they've got a brand name, they've got free celebrity advertising. They also, in 2012, the family had run Birkenstock, and they were a very conservative family in terms of how they ran the company. They hired this guy called Oliver Reichert, an outsider, to come in as CEO. And he was great. He kept the Birkenstock image, but he made the growth rate that had settled into about 7 or 8% become 25%. And here's what he did. He partnered with Prada and the big fashion companies as a Prada Birkenstock. You can go online and buy it if you want. It's like $1,500. But basically, he found a way to make the growth. And finally, in the summer before Birkenstock went public, the Barbie movie came out. Any of you see the Barbie movie? Okay. How many saw the Barbie movie? Okay. What's Barbie got to do with Birkenstock? Do you remember? She wears pink Birkenstock. Go back and watch the movie. Birkenstock got a 30% bump in sales in the summer after the Barbie movie came out. All intangibles, right? If you get a chance, go on my blog, because I said lots of intangibles. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take those intangibles and show you where in my valuation they're going to be. The Barbie buzz is going to be a 1-year bump in the growth. So first year's growth is going to be higher because of the Barbie buzz. The great management is going to transcend the fact that this company is going to be able to grow 10%, 15% a year instead of the 5% you see in footwear companies. Where does brand name show up? What's the power of a brand name? You get to charge a higher price for the same product as higher margins. Birkenstock's margins were 24%. A typical name footwear company was around 12 to 14%. And the fact that you get celebrity advertising essentially means you're reinvesting less. Brand name companies, their big reinvestment is building a brand name and you're getting it for free. Every single intangible, I said, this is where I'm showing in my valuation. I could be wrong, but that is my job in valuation. You tell me a story, I've got to find a place to put that story. Every number has a story. Every story has a number. So valuation is a bridge between stories and numbers. It requires both storytelling and number crunching skills. So I tell my class at the start, because I have 350 MBAs in my class, the split there is about 200 number crunchers and 150 storytellers. So I turn to the storytellers and I say, by the end of this class, I hope you're comfortable enough with numbers. You'll still be a storyteller first, but you're comfortable enough with numbers that you become a disciplined storyteller. In other words, when you tell a story, you say, hey, that doesn't make sense. And then I turn to my number crunchers and I say, by the end of this class, I hope you can trust your imagination enough to let it loose to become imaginative number crunchers. You know which group I have trouble with every single semester? Getting storytellers to develop discipline or number crunchers to let loose their imagination. The number crunchers give me trouble, more trouble every single time. Because you've spent a lifetime being told that being subjective. People who are number crunchers use the word subjective as if it's a curse. You're being subjective. Of course I'm being subjective. I am trying to forecast the future. How the heck can you objectively do it? So if you're a number cruncher, you're trying, your job is to work on that imagination, letting loose, being okay, making that leap where there is no connecting tissue. And if you're a storyteller, you're luckier because the numbers we work with, if you can add, subtract, multiply, and divide, that's the numbers, right? This isn't stochastic calculus. You can pick up enough numbers, enough understanding of the accounting and the terms used to become a disciplined storyteller. Okay. So here's what I'm going to do. Okay. I'm going to talk about how I had to teach myself storytelling. Because I'd love to tell you that I knew this right from the beginning. I started teaching my first valuation class in 1986. And I taught it like a number cruncher did, which is, when in doubt, put up an equation. If you're still doubtful, put up another equation, make them simultaneous equations, solve it. It'll make you feel better, even if it does absolutely nothing. And then about 6 years into teaching this class, I realized I had a crisis of faith. Strange word, faith, right? But I don't value companies for others. I'm not in the appraisal business. I don't do expert witness work. I value companies for an audience of one. And why do I value companies? Because I want to be able to act on those valuations. You know what I mean by act on those valuations, right? You value a company at 50, the stock is at 40. What should you be willing to do? Buy it at 40. But that requires faith. Faith in what? First, faith in your value. What? Because you made a lot of estimates to get there. And what's the other thing that needs to happen for you to actually make money? Even if your value is right? The price has to move to value. You have to have faith that that'll happen. Because I use the word faith intentionally. Because people often ask me, can you prove to me that your value is right? And of course I can't prove to you that my value is right. And then say, can you prove to me that if I get the value right, I'll make money? No, I can't do that either. So why should I do it? For the same reason you go to church every Sunday and you follow the 10 Commandments. You do it because you believe. If you go to your priest and say, can you prove to me God exists? If that priest is an honest priest, he'll say, no, I can't prove, but you have to have faith. In my valuation classes, I tell them, look, I can teach you the mechanics of valuation. I can teach you the storytelling. I can teach you how to value companies. But I can't convey my faith, because faith comes from within. It comes from acquiring enough. And for some of you, that faith will never come, in which case you're okay if you're doing valuations for others. It's a job. But if you want to act on your valuations and you find yourself constantly holding back, that's okay. Just buy index funds, go back to living the rest of your life. But faith is that ingredient. I found that I had no faith. And then I asked myself, why? Because I could value just about anything mechanically. And the answer I came up with was, there's no story connecting tissue holding these numbers together. I don't remember the exact day, but I said I need to teach myself storytelling, because it doesn't come naturally to me, and make it part of my valuation. And the only way you can do that is to slow the process down and force yourself to tell a story. So I go through a 5-step process, and I went through this with MercadoLibre last week, so you'll see the process play out. I start with a story for the company, always. Because left to my own devices, you know what I'm going to be tempted to do, right? Open an Excel spreadsheet, go to the races with the numbers. I start with the story. What does that require? That I understand what the company does, what the product looks like, what the competition. In other words, I call this surveying the landscape, understanding what the company is doing and what the market it's serving is, so I can tell the story. That's the first step. The second stop is going to sound like a strange stop, but I'm going to do it anyway. As human beings, we're capable of amazing amounts of delusion, of deluding ourselves. You really love a company, you're going to find a way to buy it, right? So when you tell a story, you could tell a fairy tale. So in the second stop, I've got to stop and try to be as honest with myself as I can be. And ask 3 questions. Is it possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? Sounds like I'm playing on words, right? With each one, I'm upping the ante. Lots of things are possible. A subset are plausible. An even smaller subset are probable. I'll give you a very simple way of thinking about the 3 words as we go through. So step 2, I've taken my story through that process. It's possible, it's plausible, it's probable. Third step, I'm going to take the story and convert it to inputs into my valuation. In my case, it's easier to do because my valuations are parsimonious. When I value companies, the value comes from 4 inputs. It's only 4. Revenue growth, what I think margins will do, what reinvestment I need for that revenue, and the risk in the company. That's it. I've never valued a company with more than 12 line items ever in my life. So because my valuations are parsimonious, I can say, where will this show up? How will I show the story in growth and margins and reinvestment and risk? That's step 3. Once I've converted my story into valuation inputs in step 3, the valuation kind of does itself in step 4. Because once you have the numbers, the valuation is pretty mechanical. Step 4, the inputs become a value. And I'm feeling pretty good about myself, right? I've told a story about a company, that's my story. I've converted the story into inputs, the inputs into value. And here's where I encourage you to go into step 5, though no one likes step 5. Normally when you value a company and you show it to other people, what do you want them to tell you? Amazing job. That's exactly how I'd value companies too. And if you hang out with other people who think like you, also taken the CFA, and you're using the same thing that you were taught to do, you're all going to pat yourself on the back saying, this is amazing. Look how amazing we are. My advice is don't hang out with people like that. When you're done with evaluation, you got to seek out people who think least like you, who are most likely to push back and disagree with you. And don't get defensive, because what you're trying to do is extract from what they're saying things you can use to make your story better. Call this keeping the feedback loop open. When I valued Airbnb at the time of its IPO, which was in November of 2020, if you remember, at the peak of COVID, Airbnb goes public. The first person I showed my Airbnb valuation to was a friend of mine who's a dentist in San Diego, but he owns 3 Airbnb properties. You know what I wanted feedback on? Do I have this business model right? Do they actually keep 14% of what you pay on an Airbnb? How does this work? Do they have additional fees they charge you, revenues they make? You know what? I learned interesting things about that Airbnb host relationship I would never have learned if I talked to just the management. It's keeping the feedback loop open. So let's start the process and let's look at the first step in this process. You sit down to value a company. You've got to survey the landscape. It's a strange way of saying this, but think about what the company does. What does it sell? Is it good? Is it bad? Why do people like it? I'll make a statement. Valuing a B2C company is always easier to do than valuing a B2B company. Why is that? Because you have a B2C company, it's an item that you might have seen in the store, right? When you value Uber, you're not saying, what does Uber do? You've used Uber, you basically know how this model works. I ask you to value Palantir. What does Palantir do? Really mysterious thing. It's business. I still remember in 2018, a company called Beyond Meat went public. Remember that company? What did it do? What was its claim to fame? Basically, it's pea-based protein that tastes exactly like meat. Now, this is probably sacrilegious in Argentina, right? Beyond Meat, I didn't think got to that level of saying, we'll sell you steak that tastes just like steak, but it's made with peas. And I remember reading it, it can't be. How can you make peas taste like steak? So you know the first thing I did is I drove to the grocery store, bought a couple of packets of Beyond Meat, and I cooked them up to see if it was true. And it's actually pretty close to true. It tastes disgustingly like meat. In fact, they get all the strands. They get everything, even the texture like meat. But I needed to do that because if I'm valuing the company and that's their biggest pitch, I want to make sure the pitch actually works. So I keep reading the prospectus and they talk about the fact that they're going to be able to get a really big market. Because as I read, who buys pea-based meat? Guilty millennials who really love meat, right? Let's face it, that's who buys it, right? You really love meat, but you worry about the environmental damage and cows and all that. Oh my God, I really love meat. I want to give it up. I'll buy Beyond Meat instead. How big is that market? On any given day, a few 100,000, maybe a couple of million, a few million. It's a big market. But not big enough to make a company into a gigantic company. So I say, so as I read the prospectus, they talk about the hundreds of millions of people who will buy this meat. And I say, where are these people? And they start talking about vegetarians, especially in South India, who will be prime market. And I said, that is not going to happen. I grew up with these vegetarians. They've never eaten meat. They find the look of meat absolutely disgusting. Forget about the taste of meat. You're going to give them a product that just looks just like meat and you expect them to buy it? That's when I knew Beyond Meat, it was going to become a niche company. But to do that, I needed to understand the product, see what it looked like, and say, nobody outside of this niche millennial market is going to buy this product because that's what it is. So I'm going to take 3 companies through this process, and if I run out of time, I'll stick with 2. Right? First company I'm going to use to illustrate this is the company that gave birth to my Narrative and Numbers book. In June of 2014, I think it's June 3rd or 4th, it was Monday, I opened up the Wall Street Journal. At that time, it's a physical copy of the Wall Street Journal rather than the digital version. And I see a news story. The news story says a company called Uber had raised $3 billion from venture capitalists who had priced the company at $17 billion. Let me repeat that again, priced the company. I use the word priced and valued deliberately. What's the difference between the 2 words? What's the difference between pricing something and valuing something? Anybody want to give that a shot? Let's see if the CFA got this nailed down or not. What's the difference between pricing something and valuing something? How do you value something? You spend 3 levels of the CFA doing, what do you do? You estimate cash flows, growth, and risk. You might put it into a DCF model, and you come up with the value, right? That's value. How do you price something? You look at what other people are paying for similar things. If any of you own an apartment or a house, think of how you decided how much to pay. You didn't do a discounted cash flow of your apartment, right? You looked at, that's pricing. You think those unsophisticated real estate people. You open up an equity research report, what do you see? A multiple and comparables. For God's sakes, if you use a multiple and comparables to put a number on something, do not use the word value for what you just did. You priced it. Nothing wrong with it. And I use the word pricing for venture capitalists because VCs are incapable of valuing anything, even a $20 bill in a brown paper bag. They price things based on what? Number of users, number of subscribers. Priced it, etc. And I was surprised because I'd never heard of Uber. You think, what were you, living underground? Technically, yes, because I was in New York. I took the subway everywhere. I didn't use the car service at all. But I should take that back. I'd seen the word Uber on my credit card statements in the 2 months leading into June of 2014. Because it turned out that my second son was living in North Carolina and going to college there, was using Uber and backing it up with my credit card. Don't ask me how that happened. But I thought he was taking German language classes, to be quite honest. The no umlaut on the U should have kind of given it away. So the minute I read the story, guess who I call? My son. But he was still sleeping. It's 11:30 in the morning, but he kept what I call college student hours. You know, remember those? Which have nothing to do with the sun coming up and the sun going down. It's like a different, I don't even know I don't think college students can ever feel jet lag. Because they're never in any time zone anywhere. What difference does it make? You could move 16 hours. Hey, it feels exactly the same way as it did yesterday. And he wasn't picking up his phone. He must have put it on silent. So I decided to call my niece, who lived and worked in Chicago, and she had to be technically awake because she had a job. But she was in a horrible mood. She picks up the phone and says, "What do you want?" This is how she greets a favorite uncle. I said, "Have you heard of this company called Uber?" She said, "It's a ride-sharing company." I said, "What the heck is a ride-sharing company?" She said, "I don't have the time to tell you. Why don't you download the app and find out for yourself?" Slams the phone shut. Talk to her mother about this behavior. But I did, sitting in my New York office, download the app, and I hit the app, and magical things start to happen in my smartphone. A GPS opens up, and I can see a car trying to come towards me. Why? In New York City, you don't get from point A to point B, you just try. You drive in the general direction. So I can see the guy zigging and zagging, and I can see the name of the driver. It's George. Never happened to me with a yellow cab. I'm fascinated. 15 minutes later, George and the car pull up in front of 44 West 4th Street, which is where NYU is. I ran out of the car, and George asked me, and I said, "Hi, George," to show him I knew his name. I thought he'd be impressed, but he wasn't in the least bit. He said, "You didn't enter a destination. Where do you want to go?" I said, "Nowhere in particular, but could you drive me around for about 30 minutes? I have some questions to ask you." He thought briefly that I was a serial killer, but then he said, "You know what, get in the back." And I started asking him questions. I said, "Is this an Uber car you're driving?" He said, "No, this is my car." I said, "Are you an Uber employee?" He said, "I'm an independent contractor." I said, "Why do you do this?" He said, "I have a regular job that I don't make enough money at. I already own this car. This allows me to earn a second income." I said, "Why do you need Uber?" He said, "In New York City, it's illegal to stop on the street and offer somebody a ride. Uber connects me with customers." Now I could see why this guy drove for Uber. It allowed him to generate a second income in something he already owned. 30 minutes later, he drops me back in front of NYU. I offered to pay him. He says, "You don't have to pay me." I said, "It's free?" He said, "No, it's not free." He said, "When you downloaded the app, they asked you for a credit card." I said, "Yes, they did." He said, "They'll charge you." And I said, "How do you get paid?" He said, "They'll send me 80% of the fare." And I said, "Why 80%? He says, "I don't know. That's what they all do." And he drives off. At that point, I knew why Uber did what they did. For connecting cars to customers, they got a 20% slice of the fare. Which left me with one final question. Why do people like my son and my niece like Uber? So I decided to call my son again, this time at an hour where he could not be sleeping, 3:30 in the afternoon. He was finally awake. And I decided to put him on the defensive right away. I said, I noticed you've been using my credit card to back up your ride sharing. I acted like I knew what it was all through. I said, why would you do that? You took a car down to North Carolina when you went to college. Why would you need a ride sharing service when you have a car already? He said, Dad, on Friday nights and Saturday nights, I really like Uber. Now, as a parent, there are some follow-up questions you don't ask about what's different about Friday nights or Saturday nights, but I kind of got it. I said, what do you like about Uber? He said, I can call the car from the bar. The truth comes out. So I asked him, you have to wait forever, right? And he said, they come sooner than a cab. You must pay a lot, right? He said, cheaper than a cab. So cars must be filthy, right? He said, cleaner than a cab. I said, let me get this straight. They come sooner than a cab, they're cheaper than a cab, they're cleaner than a cab. That's when I knew cab service was pretty much destined for doom. And one final question I had was, what's so special about Uber? Why couldn't I buy a powerful computer, go down from a basement, and start connecting cars to customers? There were two things Uber had that I did not. One was 3 billion. They had it, I did not. A little bit of a disadvantage. The second is, this is a business with networking benefits. It's a fancy word, but what does it mean when a business has networking benefits? As you get bigger, it actually gets easier to get bigger. Usually as you get bigger, you have to struggle more. When you're in a business with networking benefits, as you get bigger, what is it about ride sharing that creates networking benefits? Let's say you lost your job tomorrow. It's Monday, it might very well happen. The market keeps doing what it is, right? And you want to become a driver for a ride-sharing service. And you have Uber, and you have a nice startup, Argentina-based ride-sharing service that's supposedly nicer to its drivers. Which one are you going to? And you have to pick between the two. You have to go only one of the two. Which one are you going to go to? You're going to go to Uber because that's where all the customers are, right? Signing up with this nice startup, there are no people on the platform. And if you're a customer downloading an app, guess which one you download? The one with the most drivers on it. So as you get bigger, it actually feeds on itself. In fact, Silicon Valley became very clever about what they call this flywheel. They started using it for every company. So look, we can get bigger, and as we get bigger, we'll be winner, take all businesses. But Uber, it actually worked. That was my background research on Uber. You see, you didn't even look at a single number. There was nothing to look at. It was a privately owned company where there were no financial statements to look at. In fact, all I knew were two numbers about the company. What they had is gross billings in the previous year and how much money they lost. Let me ask you a question, though. If I'd given you all of the financial statements for Uber, what would you have learned? That they're a small company losing. Financial statements for a young company tell you very little. That's my first company. Second company is Ferrari when it went public in 2015. So Ferrari went public in 2015, founded in 1948 by Enzo Ferrari. Stayed a private business, he owned it, and in the 60s he got into trouble. He had to sell 90% of the business to Fiat Chrysler, where it sat for almost 50 years. 2015, Fiat Chrysler spun it off, it became a standalone IPO. So before I tell the Ferrari story, I just want to make sure that I don't insult anybody in the room. Anybody in this room own a Ferrari? I made this mistake a few months ago. I was talking to a group of Chinese investors and said, anybody in this room own a Ferrari? 7 people put up their hands. Okay, I won't own. I'll start with the bad news on Ferrari. The bad news for Ferrari is it's a car company. You know why that's bad news? Every year I go through this very perverse exercise of ranking businesses from best to worst. So I have industry group now. And every year, these are the 10 worst businesses to be in. You can probably guess a few that stay on that list every year. Want to name a few? Airlines, every single year, right? Horrifically bad business. I don't even know why an airline exists, let alone grows. Horrifically bad business. Automobiles, for much of the last 20 years, maybe even 30 years, it's been a horrifically bad business. You're saying you're just making that up? Let me back that up. In 2014, you looked at the entire automobile business. Collectively, that business had been growing at about 5.6% a year over the previous decade. Single-digit growth globally. And half of that growth came from one country, China. So it's a slow growth business with horrifically bad operating margins. The median operating margin for an automobile company is about 4.5%. And 1/3 of automobile companies in 2014 lost money. Low revenue growth, terrible margins, let's nail the coffin shut. Usually if you're a low growth company, one of the benefits you get is you don't have to build assembly plants, not much CapEx, right? But with automobile companies, that's not been true because these companies have had to spend increasing amounts on R&D every year on the computerization of cars. You take low growth, terrible margins, lots of reinvestment, you can already see what the end game is going to look like, right? In 9 of the 10 years leading into 2015, automobile companies collectively earned a return on capital less than their cost of capital. So that's the bad news for Ferrari. It's in a bad business. What's the good news? It's not just another car company, right? In fact, I'm not even sure it's a car. It's a very impractical car. There was a guy in the town I used to live in New Jersey who had a Ferrari. I never saw him drive it. It's kept in an extra armored garage with 2 guards in front of the garage. You could break into this guy's house multiple times every day. You wouldn't even notice, but his car was well protected. Rumor has it that one time every year you'd take the car out for a drive, a ceremonial drive, and then drive it back into the garage, lock it up again for the next year. Who can blame him though? Where are you going to drive your Ferrari? You imagine having a Ferrari, driving in Buenos Aires and parking it on the street and walking into a store. Doesn't even have to get stolen. Somebody bumps into the side. You know how much it costs to fix a bump on a Ferrari? Probably more than you make in a month. What about driving carpool in a Ferrari and you have 3 kids to pick up? What are you going to do, stack them up on that one seat? So why do people pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for a car you hardly ever drive? Because you become part of a really exclusive club. Let me show you how exclusive. In all of 2014, around the entire world, you know how many Ferraris were sold? 7,255 cars. I'll give you just to give you perspective. You know how many cars Volkswagen sold in 2014? 9 million cars. Remember Tesla was getting into trouble because they couldn't make 5,000 cars in a week? Ferrari makes and sells 7,255 cars in the entire year. It's terrible, right? That's the bad news. The good news is their operating margin is 18.2%. You remember what the median was for the automobile business? 4.5%. Why is it so high? Because they charge sky-high prices and they spend nothing on traditional marketing. They have the Formula One sponsorship. Have any of you seen a Ferrari ad on TV that says 10% off, come on in? You will never see it. They don't want the riffraff buying a Ferrari. There's a Ferrari in San Diego where I live. One of these days I'll get the courage to go into the showroom because I'm afraid they'll ask me to show me your last 10 tax returns. How many zeros are there? No, not enough zeros. Leave and come back when you make at least 100 million a year. There's probably a checklist on what you do to get a Ferrari. It is an exclusive club. And here's the added bonus. Because they've sold about 7,000 to 8,000 units forever, they still make Ferraris in that same assembly line that they built in 1948. So very little reinvestment needed. And here's the final bonus. Remember 2009 was a terrible year for most businesses. Ferrari sold as many cars in 2009 as they did in 2008. They sell to people who are so rich that a bad year for them is they're worth only 4 billion rather than 6 billion. You know how that's going to show up in the valuation, right? You're going to see a low cost of capital, a low growth rate, a high margin. It's an exclusive club. As I said, I was looking for a company to value, and it was suggested to me that I pick an Argentine company. So I went down your list of 20 largest companies. And you know what my reaction was? boring, 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 dead, dying, declining. I mean, you got a bunch of financial service companies, boring. A segment of commodity. I mean, what story are you going to tell for YPF? Company has nothing to do with its own story, right? It's basically an instrument of the oil price. And I wanted something more fun to do. I'll ask you afterwards, you want to value, YPF, what would your story be? And your story is going to take 1.5 minutes to tell. There's not much there. So I picked the only really exciting Latin American company I've passed by in the last few years. Company where there is a story. I picked MercadoLibre. I heard that somebody in the audience is from Mercado. Am I right? Okay. So tell me if there's something I've missed in this story. Let's start by setting the stage, right? Started as attacking the retail business. Somewhere along the way, the financial services business opened up. So first thing I wanted to find out is how big is the Latin American retail market? Turns out it's a pretty big market. It's $1.5 trillion. The three biggest countries in there, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil in terms, because the population gives you the most buying heft. And of the about the 1.5 trillion, about 180 billion comes from online retail. That number has grown over time. It will continue to grow. The growth rate in the overall retail market in real terms, probably like 5 to 7. That's assuming a fairly smooth path for Latin America. With Latin America, you always have that if in that statement, because God only knows what the next decade will bring. But online retail will grow at a faster rate because it'll become a higher percentage. I'm setting the stage for the market. So this is a big market. The online retail segment is growing. And for the moment, MercadoLibre dominates that online retail. And every other part of the world where in online retail, who's the elephant in the room that you worry about? Amazon, right? You go to India, Flipkart, Amazon came along, ruined the business for Flipkart. So clearly, MercadoLibre is doing something that keeps outsiders out because there's something that. So that's the place I started. I know very little because I don't shop on MercadoLibre. I don't know how easy it is to do. So I started to take a look at what made the company. And I think it's you're selling MercadoLibre short by calling it. I heard people on Wall Street call it the Amazon of Latin America. It's a very different animal. And what makes it different, of course, is Mercado Pago. There's a fintech, a financing arm. Initially, I thought it was just a payment processing part. And then you start digging, and it's a payment processing part. It's a bank. It's a portfolio manager. It's clearly there are potentially all kinds of things that come in here because you leave money in your wallet. They pay you interest. So it's a very interesting side business because often financing arms are completely captive. They make money only on, so Volkswagen Capital, terrible business because all it does is lend money to people buying Volkswagens at below market rates. Nobody's going to buy Volkswagen Capital from you for any amount of money because that's not the case. You have a payment processing business. And there's also a logistics side that's been clearly developed that gives them that advantage of being able to deliver quickly through much of Latin America. Trucks, aircraft. This has been a long time building. And it gives them an advantage when an Amazon comes in because Amazon has to start from scratch. And the payment processing actually makes this a stickier site because if you got your money in a Mercado Pago wallet, it's easier for you to show. So what I was looking for is what makes it sticky, because that's going to play a role in my story as to what the future will bring. If online retail grows, why will this company have an advantage? And there's another aspect of the company that I think, when I look for the number of users on the platform, I got wildly different numbers from 100 to 200 million, but the actual original users, about 100 million. That's a lot of people on the platform using one or more of the products. Right now, it's retail and this fintech arm, but you've got 100 million people on the platform, right? And go what other business you might be in. That platform could be used to enter other businesses because you have a customer base that likes what you do, that trusts you, and who knows what other dimensions you can push there. Right now, I'm not willing to put a number on it, but there's that optionality. It's that right tail in your value. And I think that exists for this company. As I said, my understanding of the company is still surface level, but it's kind of, that's what I got by looking at both the qualitative and the quantitative data. So what have I missed about the company? Nothing so far? Okay. So when I do my evaluation, you can tell me what I missed. Okay? So I did look at the numbers for the company. I find this is one of the graphs I always start every company evaluation with, where I start with the revenues. So there's the red line. I then put the gross income, the green, and the operating income, the blue. So basically, you can see the company has grown over time. I estimate two margins, a gross margin and an operating margin. What does a gross margin tell you about the business? It tells you something about unit economics in the business, right? When you sell that extra unit, gross margin tells you what it costs you to sell that unit. Operating margin tells you what you're left with after other operating expenses. In fact, the gap between gross and operating margin gives you a sense of how much economies of scale can help you in the company. The greater that gap, the larger there's potential. And there's an interesting story that you can see when I break things down by period, right? Let's start with the good part of what you see there. What's happening to revenue growth as the company gets bigger? It actually gets higher, which actually cuts against what usually happens. This is a company that's actually scaling up very well. That's the good news. But it is doing so by giving up something. Life is a trade-off. They're doing it with lower gross margins than they used to. The net effect, I think, is still positive, but that's got to go into my story. It's a revenue growth story. But if they want to keep this revenue growth going, it'll probably come with gross margins not going back to what they used to be in the glory days, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So that's the background. Let's talk about what to do then. One more thing. When you value a company in Argentina, you value a company in Venezuela, I don't want to put you in the same bucket, I'm sorry to do that, but well, the country risk, it's almost like the country is a player in your story, right? And when the country is a player in your story, it can cause your story to go off the tracks. So when you look at Argentina, one of the problems I had is I could take even mature companies in Argentina and they could become volatile, not because of the business they're in, but because the country risk in there can make. So I actually took a look at, I think it was Edenor, right? It's a regulated utility in much of the world. If you say regulated utility, you know what I think? Revenues are predictable, margins are stable. And then I took a look at Edenor's numbers and said, this doesn't look like a regulated utility to me. This looks like a technology company that imploded. Yeah? And it's really nothing to do with the company. That's basically currency and country risk ravaging the financial data. So what does it mean for you? When you value Argentine companies, if that's your area, your historical data becomes almost useless as a basis for your story. Doesn't mean you still have to value those companies, but you have to value them based on understanding the business, looking at the rest of the world and seeing what the business can evolve in, and throwing in a dose of what will the country look like. Every investment in Argentine company is a joint bet on the company and the country, right? So if you think the country is going to hell in a handbasket, I don't care how great a company is, you'll find yourself hard-pressed to buy it. It's obvious, but might as well put it on the table. I don't like to invest usually in companies where the country is a central player in the game because it's too unpredictable. I'm not an analyst of countries or the sovereign risk or political risk, but it is what it is. You can take all 20 of those, the 20 largest market cap companies in Argentina, look at the financial data. Look at it in pesos, look at it in dollars. You can see the kind of ravages created by country and currency risk, which essentially is neither here nor there. In the past, obviously, but it does mean that I can't do so. Luckily for me with Mercado, because they're a NASDAQ-listed company, I was able to do it in dollars, and the dollars basically told a story that I could use to actually build my own story. So now comes the next step. You've understood what the company does, you understand the business, you now have to tell a story. Let me remind you again, you're telling a business story, not writing a creative novel. Don't bring on characters who don't belong in the story. Don't tell me a story that lasts 16 hours. I'll tell you the story you shouldn't be telling me. About 20 years ago, my oldest son came to me with a book he suggested I should read. And I take my kids' reading suggestions very seriously. So I said, Ryan, what should I read? And he gave me this book. It's like 1,200 pages thick. I look at the title. It says, Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin. So I started reading the book, and halfway through the book, I called him and I said, Ryan, I'm too old for this book. There are hundreds of characters. They die, they come back to life. They're good guys, they're bad guys. I've completely lost track. If you're telling a business story, please don't make it Game of Thrones. You don't have 8 seasons and 80 episodes to tell your story. You have like 15 minutes. So as you think about stories, two suggestions. One is keep it simple. A good business story should be told in 10 or 15 minutes using no buzzwords. And especially with tech geeks, I suggest them, don't use the kind of words that you use with each other in technology. You need to be able to tell your story in words that anyone can understand. Keep it simple. And keep it focused. On what? What's the end game for every business? You got to make money. Be amazed at how often I listen to founder stories, especially from tech geeks, and 25 minutes and telling me how amazing their software is and how many people have downloaded it. I finally put up my hand and say, how do you plan to make money? Say, what? I'm supposed to make money? I haven't thought about that, but tell me again, I'll tell you again how amazing my product and how many. You got to at least tell me you've thought about the possibility that you need to make money on a business. Is it a subscription model? Is it a transaction model? Is it an advertising model? Keep it simple, keep it focused. So I'm going to try to take my own advice and tell you my stories for Uber, for Ferrari, and for Mercado. For Uber, here was my story in June of 2014. I described Uber as an urban car service company. So where do I see Uber succeeding? What does the word urban carry? Cities and big towns. And will draw new users into the business. People like my son and my niece, young people who are not likely to take cab service might take this, so it brings in new people. With local networking benefits. I already talked about networking benefits, right? As a ride-sharing company gets bigger, at some point there'll be a tipping point where it ends up dominating the market. You're saying, what's the local doing in there? In my story, Uber can end up dominating New York, Lyft can take Chicago, Didi can take Beijing, Grab can take Kuala Lumpur, and Ola can take Mumbai. You're saying, who cares? When I build my valuation, it's going to determine what kind of market share I can give Uber. But I did assume in 2014 that they could keep doing what they were doing, keep 20% of the fare and not own the cars. 20% is completely arbitrary if you think about it, right? Could have been 15, it could have been 25. Somebody made up that number, it stuck. With Ferrari, my story is that they would stay an exclusive club. Remember, they don't have to. Maserati in 2009 actually chose to become less exclusive by introducing a cheaper model. Don't get too excited, it's not that cheap, called the Ghibli. Ghibli was a $150,000 car. It worked. In what? Doubling the revenues. So instead of selling 8,000 cars, Maserati sold 16,000. You're saying, that's good. But there's a consequence. Their margins drop because now they had to advertise, and the cash flows became much more volatile because now you are selling to people who are just super rich, not super, super rich, and they actually felt a recession. So I'm going to assume they stay in exclusive club. What does that mean? Well, they can't grow very fast. Or they can, but they don't want to because then they become less exclusive. But they'll have sky-high margins and low risk. And finally, for Mercado, here's what my story was, and you can push back. I do think that they would stay Latin American focused for the moment. That's where their strengths are, and I think it'd be a mistake to try to distract yourself. Let's go to Asia, let's go to North America. Okay. The Latin American market, I think, will continue to grow. The online part will continue to grow, and Mercado will dominate that online retail market because here again, there's a networking benefit. The reason I go to Amazon in the US to get stuff is everything is there. Okay. Does Mercado have a version of Prime? Do you know? Do you have a version of Prime? Was it an annual subscription? Monthly subscription, right? You know, average Amazon Prime member buys 3 times more from Amazon than a non-Prime member. So actually, in terms of revenues, it's not just a subscription. I know what that statistic is. I look for it in Mercado's financials. I could not find it. But it'd be interesting to see what does a subscriber member buy relative to somebody who's not a subscriber. So my story is an upbeat story, and it's built around both retail and fintech, because Amazon doesn't have a fin side, so I don't have to worry about it. But here, this fintech side will continue to become, in many ways, perhaps more valuable and have more growth than the retail side. Right? Because you're going after soft competition for the most part, right? Banks in Latin America are soft and a little spoiled sometimes. And you can go after the softest underbelly of banks. And that's what fintech companies do, is they play regulatory arbitrage. They take the businesses you take for granted, where you essentially make big margins and you really don't work for it. And so it's an upbeat story of continued growth. I do think their margins will come under pressure in trying to grow, because at some point in time, you'll have to enter lower margin businesses to keep the growth going. So all of that is going to play out in their story. So I've told a story, right? What's the next step? I have to make sure that I'm not fooling myself. Remember the 3-part test. Is it possible? Somebody's done it somewhere before. Is it plausible? Is it probable? I know it sounds like I'm playing on words, but I'll give you my favorite way of explaining the contrast. 10 years ago, when I wrote my narrative and numbers book, I came to Latin America on a 3-city tour in 3 days. Day 1, I was in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Day 2, I was in Santiago. I think I skipped Buenos Aires that time. And day 3, I was in Lima, Peru. And I was doing this narrative and numbers. So I said, first day I show up in a room full, 300 Brazilians in a room, and I say, I want to pick a topic where everybody in this room will have an opinion. As in Argentina, what would that topic be? Football. It was 6 months before the World Cup. So I started with the question, is it possible that Brazil will win the World Cup? You asked 300 Brazilians 6 months before a World Cup, is it possible? Unanimously, they said, yeah, of course. I said, okay, is it plausible that Brazil will win the World Cup? A little more hemming and hawing. To be quite honest, if I'd asked this question in December of 2014, that room would have been a little shaky. Because remember, there was a World Cup in 2014. It happened to be in Brazil, and Brazil did get to the semifinals, and they're the good news ends for Brazilians, because they played Germany in one of the great shellackings of all time. What was it, 7-2, 8-1, whatever it was. Brazilians have conveniently had developed amnesia about that day, that year, that entire World Cup. But by 2017, they were feeling pretty good. Yeah, was 3rd ranked in the world. Pity I'm not going to Sao Paulo tomorrow, because I think they're starting to feel a little shaky again. What was it, 3-0, 10th ranked in the world? Right? And then I said, is it probable that Brazil will win the World Cup? But then you could see the wheels start to go into motion. If Neymar stays healthy and he doesn't flip and flop and do whatever else he does on the pitch, and if you're in the right group and we play and if all of that happens, then we could win. I could do the same exercise here. Is it possible that Argentina will win the next World Cup? Come on, of course. Hey? That's an easy one, right? I made that mistake in 2018. After I did Brazil, I went to Santiago, Chile. And I should have done my homework. I said, is it possible that Chile will win the World Cup? Grown men in the audience start weeping uncontrollably. I said, what the heck did I do? And they said, we got knocked out of World Cup contention 2 weeks ago. I think you have to be at the World Cup to actually win it. So, so you don't qualify. This goes out of the... So possible, plausible, probable. Think about that with Argentina in the World Cup, and you'll see with each one you're asking stuff tougher and tougher questions. You might still end up saying it's probable that they will win, but you got to get... I think the same thing about business stories. Is it possible? Is it plausible? And with each one, I'm pushing up the questions I'm asking. One of the things I force students in my class to do, and you can try this too, is watch Shark Tank. You've watched Shark Tank, right? I don't know whether there's an Argentine version of Shark Tank. There might not be, but the US version, the founder presents a story about a business, and 5 sharks, VCs, quasi-VCs, wannabe VCs, and now Ashton Kutcher showed up there, stayed on. And what do? They tell you how much they will pay for your business and for a share, $200,000. Of course, Kevin always says, I'll give you a licensing fee. That's his big thing, But basically, it's about, so here's what my students have to do. They have to listen to the founder tell a story, pause, and most Shark Tank episodes now are recorded, so they can pause it, and then think of 3 questions they would ask the founder about the story to make a judgment of, is this story possible, plausible? It's a great exercise in asking the right business questions, right? Because founders sometimes tell fairy tales. And your job is to say, hey, I'm going to ask you the question about, will somebody pay for this product? And they can get it for free. Possible, plausible, probable. Because the bane of valuation is there are a lot of fairy tales out there. I see DCFs with big names on them, Goldman Sachs, KKR, McKinsey, and I look at the valuation and this is a fairy tale. I'll give you a couple of examples. You know what a fairness opinion in an M&A transaction is? What is it? What is a fairness opinion? The bank signs off and said, you paid a fair value on this deal. That's good, right? I'll also tell you something. No deal has ever been stopped because you could not get a fairness opinion. What does that tell you about a fairness opinion? It's a fig leaf that protects you against getting sued. That's basically what it is. Once you get a fairness opinion, the Delaware courts have said, shareholders can't sue managers, even if it's a deal like the Time Warner AOL deal, where you write off $100 billion. So the entire point of a fairness opinion is to come up with something even deceptively like a valuation so you can use it as protection. So I know that bankers in the process of fairness opinions make assumptions that are almost untenable. They break rules all the time. So I read them for laughs. So this is about 10 years ago. It was a merger between 2 companies which was hopelessly conflicted right from the start. One was a company called Tesla. And who's the largest shareholder in Tesla? A guy called Elon Musk. And he was buying a company called Solar City. Who's the largest shareholder in Solar City? A guy called Elon Musk. What a coincidence. It's the same guy. CEO of Tesla was Elon Musk. The CEO of Solar City was a guy called Musk with a different first name, his cousin. 2 public companies come together. They knew they were going to get sued, so they bought themselves protection. By doing what? Solar City actually went out and hired this old-time New York investment bank called Lazard's, been around forever, to provide them with this. It was an exchange office. You had to value both firms. So Lazard did the usual banking things in valuation, like what? Apply a multiple to get a terminal value, do a little pricing dance and say, oh, this looks okay. I cut them some slack. You're doing a fairness opinion, you break rules, I understand. And then I looked at what Tesla went out and hired an investment bank called Evercore. Heard of Evercore? Right? It's a boutique investment bank. What's a boutique investment bank? It's like a gastropub. If you ever walk by airports and it says gastropub, don't go in there. It's just a burger joint that charges you 3 times the price because it's gastropub. A boutique investment bank does what investment banks do, but they charge you 3 times the fees. Evercore came ready. And they turned out a valuation of Tesla that I think is the single worst discounted cash flow valuation I've ever seen in my lifetime. That's quite a contest to win. So they projected cash flows for 5 years. They must have been using a book, maybe even mine, so they could blame me. They got to the end of 5 years, and then they assumed the cash flows grow at a constant rate forever. You say, what's wrong? This is how we were taught in the CFA. And they used a 6% growth rate in perpetuity in 2016 in US dollars. My first reaction is, what currency are you valuing it in? Maybe Argentine pesos, and you forgot to tell me. What happens to a company growing 6% a year in an economy growing 3% a year if both numbers continue forever? At some point in time, Tesla is going to become the US economy. Okay, globalization, let's keep going. 30 years later, you're going to be the global economy. Then what? Maybe there's a SpaceX portion of this story, right? What are you going to do? You're going to put Teslas on spaceships, send them off to Mars. I don't know who's buying them up there. This is a fairy tale. There's no point even checking your cost of capital, your growth rate, or how you got the numbers. It doesn't matter. Impossible valuations are valuations. You look at it, it just can't happen. Market share gets above 100%, can't happen. Margins exceed 100%, can't happen. Implausible and improbable valuations can happen, but you better have a really good story to back it up. So I'll give you an example. A company with high growth. What should you usually expect to see in reinvestment? High reinvestment, low reinvestment. Should usually be high reinvestment and probably high risk as well, right? High growth, high reinvestment, high risk go together. Low growth, low reinvestment, low risk go together. But what if I showed you a valuation of a company which is high growth, low reinvestment, and low risk? Could it exist? Yes, but it has to have a really big story. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're an infrastructure company that spent the last 20 years building toll roads, connecting major cities in a country. You finished building the toll roads. Now you're going to, open them up. You're going to get growth. Your investment's already done. Infrastructure, the investment is upfront, so you're going to reinvest. And you look at the future years, there's not much in reinvestment. You have to maintain the toll roads. You've got high growth, low reinvestment, and because these are the only major roads connecting major cities, it's low risk. You're going to have predictable revenues. But the onus is on you when there's a mismatch to explain why that mismatch exists. So implausible and improbable can exist, but they basically reflect. So I took my Uber story through. Is it possible? And clearly, I was telling a pretty defensible story. Urban car service company. By 2014, Uber was an urban car service company, drawing new users into the business. In the Bay Area, where Uber has been around the longest, they've doubled the car service business. People who never took car service took Uber because it was so convenient. It's possible, it's plausible. Could I have told a bigger story about Uber in June of 2014? Absolutely. The bigger my story gets, the more I have to play defense. The more I have to explain how I can get away with that story. So now I'm going to tell you the danger of what I call the runaway story. Once in a while, as an investor especially, you will hear a story that sounds so good and you want it to be true so much that you stop asking questions. I'll tell you the ingredients of the story. Usually there is a charismatic storyteller, somebody you really like, telling a story about disrupting a business you've never liked. And to top it all off, this storyteller tells you how he or she is going to make the world a better place. Come on, don't you want that story to be true? Sounds like such a good movie script, right? Let me tell you a story, and you tell me whether you want the story to be true. But it's about a 19-year-old who drops out of Stanford. Who does that? You know how difficult it is to get into Stanford? Acceptance rate like -3%. This person gets into Stanford, drops out to start a new business. You're another tech geek starting another software business. No, this is a woman dropping out of Stanford and starting a blood testing business. A business that nobody in the US likes. It's horrifically expensive, badly run, very, very late in getting results back. And she's going to change the whole business. Instead of taking 2 buckets of your blood, which is what traditional blood testing businesses do, she's going to take 2 drops of your blood in nanotainers. I don't even know what a nanotainer looks like, but it sounds 21st century, right? Not a bucket. She's going to run 32 tests for 32 different blood tests, and 45 minutes later deliver the results to you by email. It's almost like she's in this century, not the last one. And the whole thing will cost you less than $50. To give you a contrast, if I go to a blood test in the US, it can cost me $1,500. And in the process of doing all of this, she's also going to give away a blood test for free to parts of the world that can't afford it and save millions of lives. Come on, don't you want the story to be true? Everybody did. Venture capitalists did. They pushed the pricing up to $9 billion. The Cleveland Clinic, one of America's leading healthcare organizations, said this is an amazing company. They bought in. Walgreens, America's second largest pharmacy chain, said they were going to have a Theranos lab in every Walgreens. Everybody seemed to have bought in. In June of 2015, if you'd asked me what I thought about Theranos, I'd have said, I don't know much about the company. It's a privately owned company. But given the $9 billion pricing and the stamp of approval from Walgreens and Cleveland Clinic, there must be something there. I assume that somebody in this mix would have asked Theranos the question. What's the question you'd ask if you're investing in a blood testing company? Does it work, right? This isn't some fuzzy business. This is, does your blood test work? I thought somebody would have asked the question. It turned out I was mistaken. Because in October of 2015, a Wall Street Journal reporter asked exactly this question. And the answer was actually in the public domain, because when you have a blood testing company, you got to go to the FDA for approval. So you went to the FDA and said, they claim on their webpage that they do 32 different tests. How many of these tests have you approved them for? And the FDA said, we've approved them for one of the 32. And he said, what about the other 31? The FDA said the results are a little noisy. You know what a noisy blood test looks like? Trust me, you don't want to see it. It'll come back and say your blood sugar might be high, might be low, might be just right. Just go home, don't worry about it. Right? That's not what you want in a blood test. In a blood test, you want precision, right? And over the next 6 months, the entire company unfolded. $9 billion went to zero. Elizabeth Holmes was banned from being in the blood testing business for 3 years. She's now in jail for false claims she made to investors. And in hindsight, you're saying, why wouldn't somebody have asked the question? And let me put you in June of 2015, Elizabeth Holmes was a celebrity in June of 2015. 29-year-old woman who built $1 billion business. She came to New York to give a talk. There were 3,000 people in the audience. Many people had brought their daughters so they could see, they could build a business. I said, if you'd been in that meeting, would you have had the courage to get up and ask the question then? And the answer is no, it'd be too intimidating, right? When you have these runaway stories, it's so intimidating because it's like the emperor's new clothes, right? Remember that story? Nobody wants to ask the question because you don't want to look like the mercenary, the outsider, when somebody's telling this really magical story. I'll pass on this because, this is, I just want to. So you've told the story, you've passed it through this test. Now you connect your story to the inputs. In the case of Uber, urban car service company. So you know what I started with? The total urban car service market. It was a bear to estimate. Who dominated the urban car service market before Uber came along? Taxis. And most taxis around the world are privately owned. There was no place you could go. It's not like the automobile business where you can add up the revenues of publicly traded companies. So you know what I had to do to get the size of the urban car service market? I had to go city by city, taxi and limousine, regulators in each city, keep tabs on what the revenues are, and add them up city by city. I did for 50 cities, got really tired, and doubled the number. And I came up with 100 billion. To show you that you should not trust Google search. I put that up, I do the valuation. 6 months later, I go on Google search and say, size of the urban car service market, hoping that you know what the number one find that comes out is? Damodaran, 100 billion. If only they knew what I did to get the 100 billion. I didn't let on. So don't trust what you find on Google search as the size of a market, but that was my starting point. That market had been growing at 2% a year. But remember in my story, attract new users like my son and my niece, so I let it grow 6% a year. As a market share, I gave Uber a 10% market share, gigantic by car service standards, but it's 10% because in my story, you have local networking benefits. There can be 8 or 10 different ride-sharing companies in different parts of the world. I did give them sky-high margins. Why you're an intermediary? There's really no cost. You just connect and you keep the difference. I gave them 40% margins. And they can get the growth with very little reinvestment. Why? Because they don't own the cars. To open up a new city for Uber is almost capital free. So let them have $5 of revenues for every dollar of capital. The higher that number, the more revenue you're getting, which is twice the sales to capital ratio of any software company. Are they a risky company in 2014? Small, money losing? So I need to give them a high cost of capital. I did none of the stuff that I tell you to do to get cost of capital, like bottom-up beta, equity risk premium, lever, unlever. In the company like this is not even on my top 10 lists. So one of the things I do every year is I create a histogram of cost of capital for all publicly traded companies, all 48,000. And that year, I went to the 90th percentile, the cost of capital. That was about 12%, and I used that as my cost of capital. What's the point of finessing this and trying to do because at the young company, what's a bottom-up beta even going to mean? What are you even trying to achieve? I gave them a high cost of capital. And one of the things I should caution you, I don't know whether this is part of the CFA curriculum now because I kept pushing for them to add it, is when you do a discounted cash flow valuation of a company, you're valuing it as a going concern. What does that mean? You have a bad year, you come back. You always get to nirvana, which in a DCF is where? The terminal value. You get there, year 10, by hook or by crook, right? I could give you a distressed company, you fix it in your spreadsheet, you get it to year 10, you get a big terminal value. And it is a flaw because in the real world, do companies sometimes not make it to nirvana? Do some companies fail? Absolutely. And people say, why can't I push up the discount rate? Because discount rates are blunt instruments. They were never designed for this kind of risk. So in my Ginzu model, I have an extra input. That's what's a failure risk. If you're valuing a startup, what's that number going to look like? 2/3 of startup don't make it to year 2. You're going to have a high failure risk. And they say, what will your equity be worth if you fail? In the case of a startup, what's your equity going to be worth if you fail? Usually 0. And remember decision trees and statistics? I have my DCF value for the going concern. So you will never see a DCF that I've ever done with discount rates like 40, 50, or 60%, because that's not a DCF. That's just a made-up number. When you see VCs use target rates, they have nothing to do with discounted cash flow valuation. You're just making up a number because you know many companies will fail, and you're pumping up what you discount things by, at which point it becomes a negotiating tool. Use reasonable operating costs of capital for the going concern. If you're really worried about failure, bring it in separately. Now in the case of Ferrari, here's what the numbers look like. Because remember, I wanted to be an exclusive club. I gave them revenue growth of only 4%. Not because they can't grow at a higher rate. They have a 2-year wait list. They could grow at 15% if they wanted, but if they did, they wouldn't be exclusive anymore. I gave them sky-high margins, very little reinvestment because they have very little growth, and a low cost of capital because they sell to people who are so rich that they don't even know what a recession is. And for Mercado, here were the numbers that drove my valuation. Gave them revenue growth. I stayed with dollars. I avoided pesos like the plague. And in this case, all the financials are in dollars. I could use that as a defense. But if you gave me any other Argentine company, I'd probably switch and do it in dollars as well, because otherwise the currency will take over my story, right? You're spending more time thinking about the currency than about your story, and I want to stay focused. 25% growth going through year 5, which is pretty much what it's half the growth rate they've had for the last 4 years, but they've scaled up enough that 25% is going to provide a significant boost in revenues. I do think that as you go through time, there will be some economies of scale in overall margins from 16.3 to 18%, but not huge changes. You're not going to see a big jump in margins. I started with their effective tax rate, but right now is about 21%, and I pushed it up to 28%, which is roughly the Latin American average marginal tax rate. Eventually, I think that tax effect is going to catch up. The return on capital is, I think, going to stay high. That's a competitive advantage is playing out in my story, saying people can't enter this business easily, so they can earn well above the cost of capital. In dollar terms, their cost of capital was 12.95%. That would be high, but much of that that high cost of capital comes from the country risk premiums. I mean, when Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico are your three biggest markets, there's no way around it. Your equity risk premium will reflect it and push up your cost of capital. Right? And even in steady state, that cost of capital is not, the average cost of capital for a US company before the last 2 days was about 8 to 8.5%. So I'm leaving the cost of capital above to capture the fact that it's a great company, but it's in a risky part of the world. So June 8th of 2014, I valued Uber on my blog with all the story in. It looks like an Excel spreadsheet, but every number in the spreadsheet, if you press me on, what I got for the company was about $6 billion. I posted like 3:15. It was a Friday. 15 minutes later, I get a call from a Wall Street Journal reporter. She must have been just waiting at her desk for this to come out. She said, I noticed you valued Uber. I said, thank you for noticing. She said, I also noticed you put a value of $6 billion. I said, you're very observant. He said, you do know that venture capitalists have valued the company at $17 billion. I almost corrected her there, right? You know, with what? That they price companies, but I decided to cut her some slack. She's a journalist. I said, yes, I do know they've valued it at $17 billion. She said, how do you explain the $17 billion? I said, I don't have to. I didn't pay it. I have never felt the urge to explain what other people pay. What business is it? You know how much frustration this has saved me in my life? How do you explain, that Bitcoin is selling for Go ask somebody who paid the 90,000. Why are you asking me? And so she said, are you telling me they paid too much? I said, I'm telling you nothing of the sort. I'm saying with my story and my value, I wouldn't buy Uber. Maybe they have a bigger story. I don't own the high ground here. I have my estimate, my story, my value drives my decisions. And I would never try to convince you that my decision is the right one, because why do I care? It's your money. So I will give you the architecture, I'll give you my story, and I want you to disagree with my story and make it yours. Investing is about taking ownership of your decisions. The way you take ownership is by fleshing out the story. With Ferrari, this is the IPO story. Low growth, high margins. Value that I got for the equity was about 6.3 billion euros. Reflecting again the exclusive club story. So now, let me show you my MercadoLibre valuation. So this was, I think, 10 days ago, 9 days ago. Value that I got was about 1,600. Is it 1633? I can't even read that number. No, somewhere. Stock was at 22.81. But I have mixed feelings here. I really, really liked what I saw as a company. I just don't feel like I can pay 22.31. So I did something that I thought at that time there was almost zero chance of it happening in the near future. Was I put a limit buy at 1,600. I was just checking my phone before I came in here. And it's at 1835, 1825. Hey, 2 more days like today. I'm there, right? And it's actually, and this is when people value companies, because people in my class value companies and it's lower than the price. You say, that was such a waste of time. I spent all this time valuing the company. There's nothing I can do about it. I say, okay. Right now, you shouldn't buy the company. But you've started a process, right? The price is a moving target. Who knows, tomorrow, a week from now? No. In fact, I put 2 buys 10 days ago, and both have become closed. I put a buy on BYD, which is because I sold my Tesla 4 weeks after the election, and because it had become too political. And I liked what I saw in BYD, but it was trading at $120 per share, the ADR, and I put in a buy at 80. And I was checking before I came in again, it's at 87. So by the end of next week, I might have both BYD and Mercado in my portfolio. But that's one way to kind of, you're saying, why do you put a limit buy? Why don't you just wait for it? Because, you know why I put a limit buy? Do any of you feel like going out and buying stocks right now? It's a terrifying thought, right? In the midst of a crisis, in the intellectually, you might say, I think stocks are, but actually acting in the middle of a crisis, you just don't feel like doing it. So one of the things I find myself having to do is taking that action out of my hands and putting it into because a computer will know when it hits 80, it'll buy it. The computer has no conscience, no mind, no worries. So the limit buy is there because it helps me make these buy decisions on companies in the middle of a potential meltdown. So maybe the next time I come to Argentina, I'll be owning few thousand shares of MercadoLibre. It can't be a few thousand because the ADR sells like 1,800, 1,600. So agree with you, keeping the feedback loop open. On my Uber valuation, I got insanely lucky. I finished my valuation. So Friday night, I get calls from 4 different, I wouldn't even call them news organizations, but online news. The first was a site called 538.com. If you've never heard of it, it's run by a guy called Nate Silver. He's a statistics geek. It's designed for people who are statistics geeks. So they look at questions in sports and politics, which have statistics attached to them. And the editor of the site said, we'd like to run your blog because it has a lot of numbers that our readers would like. I said, be my guest. The second call I got was from the Forbes blog. Who reads the Forbes blog? I think 75-year-olds with flip phones. It's a really old value investing audience. They said, can we run this? Our readers would be. I said, go ahead. The third place that called was a site called TechCrunch. It's a Silicon Valley digital magazine read by tech geeks. They said, we'd love to run this. Our readers would be very interested in Uber. It's going public in a few years. I said, go ahead. Same post, same valuation. And the final place I got a call from is a site called the Ride Sharing Guy. So this guy writes just for Uber and Lyft drivers. There are millions of them, so he has a big audience. So he said, our Uber drivers would love to read about this. Can we put, so same post, very different audiences. And here's the kind of feedback I get on each one. On the 538.com site, here's the kind of question I get. I noticed you used a 12% cost of capital and you claimed it was at the 90th percentile of your cost of capital histogram. But I went and looked at your cost of capital histogram and the 90th percentile is 11.97%. Why did you use 12%? I said, okay, why don't you take the Excel spreadsheet, it's an open spreadsheet, take the 12%, replace it with 11.97%, and get back to me if anything happens. 5 minutes later, they say, oh, nothing happened. I can see why you rounded it up. So the question you're getting is the second decimal point. Questions that really don't change the value. The Forbes blog, they loved it. They said, this is what those tech guys should be doing. I completely skipped over that because what are you going to gain from people patting you on the back? The TechCrunch guys absolutely hated it. Their response was, how dare you value one of ours with your D.C.F. We don't do that in Silicon Valley. First 100 comments were pure insults. Some I didn't even understand. One said, you DCF guy. That's it. That's a whole insult. I'm saying, is that good? Is that bad? And I passed them through. The second 100 started with an insult, you idiot. Let me tell you how surge pricing works in ride sharing. And you know what? I'm not a tech guy. I learned some very interesting things about the technology of ride sharing that I would never have learned if I stopped after that first insult. And then I went to the ride sharing guy and I read some very interesting things about Uber, written by Uber drivers that I would never have learned by talking to Uber management. You know what Uber management is telling investors, right? That they kept 20% of the fare. This Uber driver wrote to me from LA and he said, look, until 2 months ago, I used to drive for Lyft. Uber paid me $3,000 to switch. Lyft is now offering me $5,000 to switch back. I feel like a free agent without a contract. And then he ended his statement by saying, by the time this is all said and done, I'd be surprised if Uber kept more than 7 or 8% of the fare. 5 years later, that's exactly what Uber confessed to, that their actual contribution margin in big cities was 7 to 8%. But it all came to almost crescendo, about 4 weeks after I wrote the post, I was sitting in Munich airport waiting for a connecting flight which was delayed. And I checked my emails, and there's an email from a guy called Bill Gurley. Any of you heard of Bill? Bill was a partner at Benchmark Capital. Benchmark Capital was one of the first VCs to invest in Uber at a $1 billion pricing. Bill sat on the board of directors. He chaired the board of directors for Uber. He was rumored to be the person closest to Travis Kalanick. Have any of you watched the Netflix series on Uber? Go back and watch it, because Bill is a big character in it. He's the guy who tries to keep Travis in line. So I open up the email. Let me start with an easy question. Does Bill Gurley know more about Uber than I do? Of course. So I open up the email, and here's how it begins. I read your blog post on Uber, and I did not like it. Okay, we got that out of the way. So I've written my own blog post to counter your blog post, very 21st century blog post to blog post warfare. And I've said some mean things about you, and I just wanted to let you know. Sincerely, Bill. I close the email. I have an hour and a half left for my flight. Guess where I go next? I go to Bill Gurley's blog. It's called Above the Crowd. He's 6 feet 6 inches. And he takes issue with every part of my story. He said, Uber is not a car service company, it's a logistics company. Notice how words have consequences? Logistics includes, in addition to car service, includes moving, it includes delivery. He said, it's not just going to be urban, it's going to be everywhere. He gave examples of rural and suburban services. And finally he said, we're going to take the cities we dominate, like New York and London. We're going to partner with credit card companies and airlines. So when you fly from New York to Jakarta, New York to Buenos Aires, right after you make the reservation, we're going to have a little box there. Do you want an Uber car waiting for you? That way, it's a very clever way of taking local networking benefits and making them global networking benefits. So I read, and along the way he said some mean things about me, like I'd never taken an Uber, which was a lie because I'd taken one Uber. Right? But I have a thick skin, so I read it and then I email him, sitting in Munich airport, Bill, this is a fascinating story. Would you like me to put a number on your story? He said, what are you talking about? I said, you told a story, I can convert into a number. He said, be my guest. So here's what I did. I went into my valuation and changed 2 numbers. Remember the total market of 100 billion, the car service business? You bring in moving and delivery, that market triples. Remember the 10% market share, local networking benefits? If Bill is right, there'll be only 2 or 3 ride-sharing companies in the world, and their market shares are going to be 30, 40, 45%. So I gave Uber a 40% market share. With those changes, the value that I get for the company is $53 billion. I sent this to Bill and said, do you like this more? He said, a lot. And he said, by the way, this 20% share is not long for the world. It's probably going to become 10%. I said, that's easy to fix. It's an input in the model. Change the 20 to 10 and say your value is 29. He said, how can the same company be worth 6, 29, and 53? Depends on how you frame the story. If I told a story for Mercado of just being an Argentine online retail company, and I forgot the financial service arm, and I forgot the rest of the country, the value I would get would be a fraction of what you saw up there, right? Because the market will be smaller, my market share, even if it's down. The way you frame your story can determine your valuation. And towards the end of 2014, I actually let people choose their own story. Because I got sick and tired of people picking on my story. I don't like your growth. It's my money, it's my growth, it's my margin. I'll make my decision. You don't like it, change it. So finally I got tired and I said, you tell me what Uber is. Car service company, logistics company. You tell me what kind of networking benefits, maybe none, local, global. And then at the end, I gave them a value that they would get to their choices. I said, you know what? You want to disagree? Fine. But that's the story you're telling. Are you comfortable telling that story? If you are, it's your money. I am not going to go around telling people they've overpaid for NVIDIA. NVIDIA was a company I used in Chile as my story company. It's a company I invested in 2018, but AI has pretty much taken over that story, pushed in the stratosphere. Right? With Ferrari, I did try the Maserati story. Remember, higher growth. Because a student of mine This is a sell-side auto analyst for a major investment bank. He wrote to me and said, why didn't you give Ferrari the Maserati story? I said, okay. I gave them higher growth, 12%. That means 16,000 cars instead of 8,000. But I did lower the margin, not to a low number, but to the 90th percentile. Why? Because you now have to spend money on marketing to get people to buy the Ghibli. And a cost of capital that now has to reflect the fact that your earnings are more volatile. Actually, the value that I got with the Maserati story was actually less than the value I got with an exclusive club. So I sent it to the auto analyst, and he wrote back and he said, couldn't you have just left the margins where they were? And that's why stories matter, because in a story, when you change a number, you got to think through the effects on the rest of your story. And that's my problem with DCF valuation, when people go out and change the revenue growth rate. What does that mean when you increase the growth rate? How did you increase it? Are you cutting prices, in which case your margins go down? Are you going into a different market, in which case your cost of capital might be affected? It forces you to think about every change you make in terms of what does it mean for the rest of the story. It makes you think like a business person, right? Growth is not easy. It's only in an Excel spreadsheet that growth is easy. 20, 25, 25, 30, 30. I mean, what stops you from just pushing the numbers up? And when you tell a story, everything is feedback. About 4 months after I wrote my Ferrari post, I was on a long flight from New York to Dublin. It must have been a really boring flight because I was actually reading the duty-free magazine, reading it, right? Usually you just look at the glossy pictures. I was actually reading the description very carefully, double reading it, checking it for typos. And then I get to a page, and on one side of the page is a Ferrari watch. The other side of the page, there's a Ferrari pen. And I said, maybe I've got the Ferrari story all wrong. You see another story you could tell for Ferrari? It's really not a car company. It's a brand name. It's a licensing company. It gets that licensing brand name from its car. So you can't leave the car business, but it can now take that name and attach it to other products. It's an insanely high margin business because you spend nothing, low capital intensity. You can attach it to pens, jackets, toilet bowls, maybe not toilet bowls, but basically you have to be careful you don't dilute your... But you could tell a story about Ferrari as a licensing company that uses its cars to essentially create this licensing empire. I'll tell you what my tipping point was for the Ferrari story. I'll stop you because I want to give you a chance to ask questions. For my Uber story, is in 2015, I went back to Chennai, which is where I grew up in South India, to visit my mother because, once a year she's in the mid-70s, very conservative South Indian woman, and if you know India, South India is the most conservative. Things are done the way they've always been done. And she says, let's go out somewhere. And I said, okay. And she says, I'm going to call the car. And I expected to open the window and say, driver, bring out the car. Because that would have been... Instead, she's hitting a smartphone. And I said, you use a smartphone? She said, all the time. I said, what are you doing? I'm calling Uber. I said, you use Uber? So all the time. I said, I can't come with you, Mom. I have to go back and revalue the company. And you see where it's going to show up, right? In my story, the growth went from 2 to 6%. Why? Because people like my son and my niece would use Uber. And I think that the more you can use that feedback, the better the story gets. So I'm going to stop there because I want to give you a chance to ask questions because there's a whole corporate life cycle thing you can do there. In fact, let me end with that. Right? If you think about stories and numbers and you look across the life cycle, for young companies, as you saw with Uber, it's mostly story, right? There's not much in numbers. As companies age, you give me YPF, not much story to tell. You're in chapter 33 of a 35-chapter book. What the heck are you going to do in the last 2 chapters, right? You give me Coca-Cola to value. The story is pretty much told. That's why number crunchers get away with those companies by never having to tell stories. You can just extrapolate data and it works. So, but if the key to driving your value changes as you think about the kind of CEO you want at a company based on where it's in the life cycle. You're a young company. What does your value depend on? Your story. So who do you want running your company? A storyteller, a visionary, essentially, because this is not about, let me show you what the ratio of this is to this last year. It's about telling a story. You want a visionary. Steve the visionary. Your vision works, you get VC money, your story starts to get some legs. You want somebody who can build a business, right? Supply chains, manufacturing. You want Bob the builder. Your company gets even bigger. It's now a bigger company. It's still a growth company. You want somebody who's opportunistic, finds new places to grow. Oscar the opportunist. I'm being a very little sexist, the 3 male CEOs in a row. But now you're a mature company. What's your job? Playing defense. You have to protect yourself. Donna the defender, Steve the visionary, Bob the builder, Oscar the opportunist, Donna the defender. And then you become a declining company. Who do you want running you? Larry the liquidator, right? Think Danny DeVito, if you've never seen the movie. You want somebody who makes your business smaller, who really doesn't care about growing the business. Now do you see why, as companies go through the life cycle, the person running the company might have to change to reflect the company. So as you look at companies, one of the questions to ask is this company got the right CEO for the company? I don't want a visionary running YPF. I would be terrified of what a visionary would do at YPF. But I want somebody with vision running MercadoLibre, because you need that vision to kind of get past and say, you want different. There is no prototype for a great CEO. It depends who you are as a company and what you're looking for. And finally, can stories change? Let me ask you a different question. Have the last 2 days changed the story for some companies? Absolutely. A company I valued Wednesday might have a very different value on Monday. It's not because I didn't do my job on Wednesday, but because the world has shifted under you. Stories can change for macro reasons. In countries like Argentina, you can have a great business story essentially come apart at the seams. Why? Because there's some country upheaval that kind of undercuts the story. It's frustrating. You say, I bought a great company, but look, but it is what it is. Stories can break sometimes, stories can shift, stories can change. And that means that this Mercado story is probably going to be the first of many, because I'll have to reevaluate a year from now and 2 years from now, and who knows what the story will look like. But to me, that's what makes valuation interesting and fascinating, is that story keeps evolving. So I'm going to stop there. Let me open up for questions. And anything to do, it doesn't have to be about narrative and numbers. If your pet thing is country risk premiums, I hate talking about country. If that is what you want to obsess about, I'll gladly answer your questions. No. But are there any questions that you have? Yes, go ahead. For a company, are you talking about long-term macro trends? I'm not a macro player. You know why? Because I'm terrible at it. No, because you can take let's take interest rates, right? You know what I use as my interest rates in valuation? Today's interest rates. Why? Because it's an opportunity cost. I can complain about them being too low, too high, not right. But it is what I can make today. This is not something where you can say, I'll normalize. I know in the last decade, there was a stupid idea of normalizing risk-free rates. CFA fell into that trap for a while. I tried to talk them out of it. You can't normalize a risk-free rate. You got to live in the world you're in, not the world you wished you were in. You can't take a 2% rate, I'll just make it 4.5%. That's not a number you want to normalize. We value an oil company. What are you going to be tempted to do? Forecast oil prices. You're saying, shouldn't I have? Let's say you believe that oil price will double over the next 5 years. And let's say you then value YPF with that forecast. What are you going to find? The company looks incredibly cheap, right? But then you got to ask yourself, why does it look cheap? Does it look cheap because I like YPF as a company, or because I think oil price will double? And you say, why does it matter? If it's because oil price will double, there's a far easier way for me to make money, which is buy oil futures. If you're that good at macro forecasting, don't waste your time valuing companies. I try as best as I can to be macro neutral in my valuation. If you ask me afterwards what I think about interest rates and oil prices, I will offer you my views. But I try to not let them enter in because that's separate. That's an asset allocation decision. So is there embedded in my valuation a view about Argentina? It's probably the kind of view that the market has right now. But then I can give you a different view. And say, I think the market is being over-pessimistic. I think Argentina's pace is going to be much better, in which case what will mean I'll invest more of my money in Argentine equities. But this is about which company should I invest in, not a macro. So I try to be as macro neutral as I can be. Yes?
Sorry, perhaps I misunderstood, but you said you put a buy order of 1,600 on MercadoLibre, and that was your fair value estimate?
It was a little below my fair value estimate.
Why would you do that?
As opposed to doing what? I'm going to let you dig your own hole. 20% margin of safety you want? You know, you want to buy at 1,300? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I'm not worried. I buy T-bills, but...
No, but there is this notion of margin of safety, right? I don't buy it. I'll tell you why I don't buy it. In a world where there are incredible opportunities, of course you can put a margin of safety. Put a 50% margin of safety. But in statistics, what are type 1 and type 2 errors? Type 1 errors are when you do something you shouldn't have done. Type 2 errors is when you don't do something you should have done. A margin of safety reduces your type 1 error. Right? You're not buying something, but does it increase your type 2 error? That's going to tip me to buy much sooner. Remember we talked about the option. That's going to tip me to buy much sooner. Remember we talked about the optionality? What does that mean? It's not in my DCF value. Companies with optionality, I will buy much more quickly. My trigger finger is much quicker. I bought Facebook when it was 3% below fair value. Why? Because I valued it as an online advertising company. But with 3 billion people on your platform, God knows what you can do with it. So business with optionality, you don't need as much margin of safety because there is an option you have in value that's not in your value. You still want to buy it because it's undervalued. But that option value is pure icing on the cake for you. If it shows up, it's going to be an extra 30, 40, 50%. If it doesn't, you still bought it at a fair value, right?
If I recall correctly, a couple of years ago, you said that NVIDIA was expensive. And
2023, summer of 2023.
Correct. Yeah, I don't remember.
Why did I do that? Well, why did I feel the urge? Fill in the rest of the story. Why did I feel the urge to value NVIDIA in 2023?
I don't know.
Because I bought it in 2018. No, I had no idea AI was coming. I'll tell you what price I got it at. It's complete luck. Split adjusted price of $2.80. Right?
Okay.
I bought it because it was cheap. So 2023, it had zoomed because of AI. And I had no choice but to revisit it. I didn't feel the urge to value NVIDIA. I had to value it because I'd asked myself, is it time for me to leave? And I did find it overvalued. Sorry, so now you can keep
No,
going.
it's okay. And as you said today,
Yeah.
AI took over the story of NVIDIA. But I thought it was very interesting, the slide you show about probable, possible,
Yeah.
and yeah. And in the possible, you had margins. Today, NVIDIA has a margin of 75. And then you talk about competition, and I thought about DeepSeek.
Yeah.
So what would be your view of NVIDIA today?
I valued it after DeepSeek at $78 per share. Before DeepSeek at 88. You're saying, what did DeepSeek change? What did DeepSeek change in the story? Until DeepSeek came along, what was the story about AI? You needed to invest in really, really powerful AI chips, which NVIDIA could make. And you needed immense amounts of data, right? That's why you were building these data centers. What did DeepSeek show? That you didn't need all that stuff for a lot of AI products and services, which I'll call low tech, not in the sense that they're bad products, but you don't need that stuff. When I initially valued NVIDIA, I gave it an AI chip market of $500 billion. That's a big, upbeat assumption because the overall AI market has to be about 3 trillion, 4 trillion. So already it's an upbeat story. I gave it a 500 billion AI chip market. But that was built on the assumption to build an AI product, you need NVIDIA chips. So DeepSeek comes along. I revisit the story. What does it do? It basically means that at least a portion of the market no longer needs the chips. There'll be a premium segment. We'll still need the NVIDIA chips. So in my I think November of 2024 valuation, right after DeepSeek, no, it's probably even later, January of 2025, I reduced the size of the AI chip market from 500 billion to 300 billion. What's that going to do? Even if I keep everything else fixed about NVIDIA, NVIDIA becomes a smaller company, less profitable company. The value went from 89 in September to 78. In September when I valued it was 89, I valued it at 89, the stock was at 108. In November when I valued it at 78, the stock was at 123. So nobody's going to ask me where my NVIDIA, what happened to my NVIDIA shares, because if you're a believer in intrinsic valuation, and I valued in September 20, in the summer of 2023, and I found it overvalued, what should I have done? Sold them all, right? I actually sold only half. And you know how much blowback I got on that? From purists. It's overvalued. So I told them exactly why I did what I did. I said I want to minimize regret. As an investor, regret is an incredibly dangerous emotion. And I'll tell you what I mean. Let's suppose I'd sold all my shares in the summer of 2023 and the stock doubled over the next year. Would I have had some regret? Of course. Let's say I hadn't sold any of my shares and the stock halved over the next year. Would I have regret? Absolutely. So I decided to have my cake and eat it too. I sold half. This way, if the stock goes up, which it did, I pointed to the half I did not sell. I said, look, I still have half. If the stock had gone down, I point to the half I sold. Look, I cashed out. And in doing all of this, I keep my frame of reference intact, which is whatever the price is, I compare back to the $2.80 that I paid. One of the most dangerous things in investing is if you keep comparing what the price is to what it was a week ago, a month ago, 2 months ago. Not only can you drive yourself crazy, but it'll drive your decisions completely off the tracks. So I own a quarter of the shares I owned at the start in the summer of 2023 today. So I sold half then, half more. So I still own on quarter. And I might add to it actually if NVIDIA drops below 78. Why? Because I want the company in my portfolio. I love the company. You can love the company and not like it as an investment, right? They're two separate. So that's my NVIDIA story. Right?
Professor,
Yeah.
Could you share some personal experiences for, in your case, investing, applying your stories?
You wanted horror story, basically? Do you like?
No. I mean, how do
I'll
you,
tell you my bad ending story.
How do you keep up with all the noise so that you doesn't get nuts?
Where's the noise coming from?
News.
So why are you watching the news? That's how I keep the noise out. I never watch CNBC. I hardly ever read opinion pieces on the market. I don't read very much. I think we read too much, to be quite honest. Our entire day is filled up with stuff that other people think, right? You know what I plan to do this weekend? Not even look at the market. What exactly is it going to do for me to read all those pieces? I think we need to think more, read less. First, it keeps the noise. Second is, the noise always comes about because you've gotten too deep into the weeds, right? So often when you feel completely overwhelmed by the noise, which right now, most people are, right? What the hell do I do? Everything's falling apart. The two things I do, one is elevate. Lift yourself above the noise, gain perspective. The S&P is down to what, 5,060? What was it at the start of 2024? 4,784, right? Okay, it's down, but it's really up 10% from where it was at the start of 2024. So sometimes elevating will give you perspective because you focus on the last 2 days. Oh my God, 10% of my portfolio went away in 2 days. Of course, nobody likes that, but stepping back and gaining. The second is go back to basics. What is it that drives the value of equities? Cash flows, growth, and risk, right? The last 2 days changed those. Start with the cash flows. What do the tariffs do? Clearly, they reduce economic growth, increase the risk of a recession. Those earnings number we saw on Wednesday, my guess is at least 10 to 20% goes off those earnings numbers. So lower earnings. Will it make companies less likely to return cash in the form? Yeah, because if you're more scared, you're not going to pay out as much as you did, right? Your payout ratio is probably going to drop. And do you feel more risk now than you did 3 days ago? Yeah, your risk premiums should go up. Does CFA even teach implied premiums yet, or is it still historical premiums? You're looking at 1926 through 20, whatever, the IBITS and the Kroll data. Let that go. It's not sensible, right? In what universe are you going to say you're going to demand the same risk premium today as 3 days ago? During crises, every time we've had a crisis since 2008, I go into daily ERP mode. No, that is every morning I compute the implied equity risk premium for the market that day. Say, how much can change in a day? Okay. The last 2 days kind of answer that question. A lot can change. I started this year with an implied equity risk premium of 4.33%. Yesterday, that number hit 5.2%. I haven't even brought today in. By the time you get to Monday, that premium might have gone from 4.3 to 5.3%, and it's completely understandable. You're going to demand a larger risk premium because you live in a more risky world. The more forward-looking and dynamic you get, the more you can bring it down to basics. So I'm going to actually, if I get a chance on my flight home, I'm going to write a piece on, hey, you're scared about the market, I can't tell you what to do, but I'm going to give you the architecture. What do you think will happen to earnings? Where do you think risk premiums are going? And then you work with the numbers and you can see the index change into. So go back to basics, step back and have perspective. And you'll find that the noise starts to kind of dissipate because the noise is almost always at that lowest level. Right? So as you get less noisy as you get above.
So, final.
Yeah.
Have you got a valuation or a personal investment run?
Investment, what?
Have you made a mistake?
Oh, absolutely, and I write about them all the time. I remember buying Vale in 2013. Why? Because I wanted to make a 3C bet. A bet on currency, commodity, and in the case of company. And all three screwed me up, right? And I wrote a piece on my blog saying, no mas, no mas. Brazilians wouldn't let me alone, say that's not the Portuguese, But I was using the Roberto Duran, this old boxing match where this guy gives up in the second round. So I said, I give up, because I listed out what I screwed up on that valuation. I've had plenty of screw-ups over time, and I've written about them. And the problem is I can't hide from my mistakes because I write about when I buy things, and I guarantee you when it doesn't work, I hear about it. Constantly, right? And I don't mind it because it keeps me accountable. I'm amazed when people get on CNBC and they say things and I remember what they said 6 months ago and it's almost like they've completely erased it, right? There'll be people on Reddit saying, I saw this coming. Really? Where were you? Oh, I knew this was going to happen. Yeah. After a correction, all of a sudden these people come out of the woodwork, right? So I put my thoughts down in real time because I can't say I saw this coming because if I did, that post 2 weeks ago should have included it. I didn't see it coming. So what? Nobody did. If everybody had, the market would have adjusted before it happened rather than after. Right?
Professor, can we do one more?
Yeah.
We have food and wine waiting for us, so.
Yeah.
Hello, sir. Good evening. If you could pick one sector and one country to be in right now, what will it be?
I pick companies. I don't pick sectors and countries because it's a dangerous game to play. I'll tell you, you got to play to your strengths, right? To pick countries, you got to be, it's really more politics than finance, gauging it. To pick sectors, you're essentially talking about valuing sectors and making judgments about sector movements over time. I'm not good at it. If I'm not good at it, I won't try it. I've never been a market timer. I value the S&P 500 at the start of every year. The start of this year, for instance, I valued as I conclude it was overvalued by about 13%. That was well before the noise of what's happened. It's right now about 3% below what I estimate. I estimate 5,200 at the start of the year. Now it's below that number. but I'll have to revisit that valuation because obviously the internals have changed. But I've never acted on a market-wide valuation because I don't see what I bring to the table that will make that have any heft. I mean, my rule in investing, if you bring nothing to the table, I don't think you should expect to take anything away. And with macro, market level things, what do I bring to the table? Right?
Well, thank you very much, Professor. It was a great master class for us. We can give you a huge applause. I hope you enjoyed the stay in Buenos Aires. We have a cocktail right now, so we invite you all to have a good and having a glass of wine in our and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you very much.